welcome. It is time once again for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana 104.5 FM and UPTV. I will be your host for this evening. My name is Mr. Garza, and I'm here to let you know that WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign community. Views expressed are those of the speakers and are not intended to represent WRFU, UCIMC, or, as we like to say on the televised version of this show, UPTV. These views are our own. Okay, so last week I started reading an article entitled Not a Nation of Immigrants. No, I just lost my place. Okay, here we go. And I thought it was important enough to continue it because I ran out of time and I didn't get a chance to finish it. So I wanted to continue it here this time. And so I hope you remember where we left off. Or generally speaking, I hope you remember the gist of it, which is basically this person is saying, no, the United States is not a nation of immigrants, at least as it has been described, that term has been used to mislead people about who we are, how we became we, and how we all ended up on this continent, basically. And so I will just start up from roughly in the area of where I left off last time. So this idea of the United States as a nation of immigrants was hatched in the late 1950s. And while Kennedy was its ambassador, he wrote a book, if you will remember, titled Nation of Immigrants. It came to reflect the U.S. ruling class response to the challenges of the post-Second World War anti-colonial national liberation movements, as well as civil and human rights social movements domestically. In the United States, the National Congress of American Indians was founded in 1944 by D'Arcy McNichol, Helen Peterson, and other longtime indigenous activists. At the same time, African American attorneys and other professionals were developing a legal strategy for desegregating public schools, while in 1951, more radical African Americans, including Paul Robeson, and members of the Civil Rights Congress petitioned the recently established United Nations with the detailed documents We Charge Genocide, based on the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. A mass movement against segregation was emerging. Around the same time, Native American activists were contextualizing the situation of Native nations within the decolonization national liberation context, and Mexican farm workers were organizing in the fields, defeating the Bracero program, and forming unions. These cracks in the racial order of settler colonialism and capitalism constituted a radical departure in a society locked down in patriarchal white domination and obsessed with real Americanism. At the end of the Second World War, the U.S. social, economic, and political order was solidly, air conditioner. The U.S. political, economic, and social order was solidly and confidently a white patriarchal Protestant republic, dominated by corporations with worldwide investments and financial reserves, along with a massive military machine far greater than that of any other country in the world. Unionization movements, primarily made up of white workers, were seduced by home ownership and middle-class status, their unions becoming business-oriented with their own profit-making privatized health care, while the United Kingdom and Western European states responded to militant union demands to institute universal public health care. Black descendants of enslaved Africans lived under a totalitarian Jim Crow system in the former Confederate States and were ghettoized and discriminated against when they escaped the South in migrations for northern and coastal industrial urban areas that were stalked by police forces resembling slave patrols. Native Americans were abandoned on shrunken land bases that could not support life, forcing many to find work in nearby or faraway cities, while Congress began reversing New Deal reforms that had acknowledged the native land base in governments. This culminated in the congressional termination of native status and land bases in 1953, an erasure that took the Red Power movement 2 decades to reverse. Meanwhile, Irish and Central, Southern, and Eastern European immigrants, mainly Catholic and Jews, had made gains in being accepted as equal, that is, white, but on the West Coast, U.S. citizens of Chinese and Mexican descent were discriminated against and subject to deportation, while U.S. citizens of Japanese descent had been incarcerated in wartime concentration camps, stripped of their property and citizenship rights. Ads for jobs segregated men and women, as well as white and black, with lower wages for women and black workers. Ivy League universities were overwhelmingly white and for men only, with quotas to limit the number of Jewish men. Okay, I'm going to step back for a moment here and say, okay, these are hard words. And I can imagine a listener who's just kind of, only sort of partially connected to these topics, hearing this and going, oh, wow, that's really, radical stuff. But it's expressed in a pretty blunt and straightforward way. But there's nothing particularly radical about what is being said. It is basic recitation of facts of history. Now, you can argue with things like the expression, a totalitarian Jim Crow system. Okay, totalitarian is a pretty strong word here, and I don't know that it entirely applies. But it applies more than it doesn't. And that's where I think some people find an easy out when they hear things like this, when they read things like this, by saying, oh, that's just too much. So then they just want to back away way over here. They're saying, okay, this is going too far in its description of things. It's too radical. So we need to step back. So instead of stepping back a little bit and saying, okay, totalitarian might be a stretch. It might be too much. But it's not enough too much that you can just go and say, well, Jim Crow was like maybe unfair, but it wasn't, a totalitarian system as this person is averring. No, it's close. It's far closer it's far closer to totalitarianism than it is to unfairness. And the same holds true with a lot of this stuff. It's not that extreme. It sounds extreme because it is so different from what most of us were raised with and taught in school and hear repeated over and over again in patriotic speeches about American history. This is far closer to the actual literal truth of the situation than those things are. But those things are so different from this that this seems extreme because we hear that stuff and we grew up hearing that stuff and we continue to hear that stuff, even from so-called progressive politicians. But that stuff is way, way off what actually was going on. And so as I read this, you're going to hear things that are like, that's so extreme. If you're not used to these sorts of expressions. But keep in mind that these are closer to the literal truth than the propagandistic, feel-good American history that you grew up with and that you continue to hear today. So I think it's important to recognize this, that the reality is not that pretty. And this is just calling it out in strong language. And, maybe if you wanted more people to accept this, you wouldn't use quite such strong language. But I don't know how else you get across the point that this is closer to the literal truth than most anything else that you have heard or are likely to hear. So Moving on with the story. The explosion that cracked the White Republic was the 1954 U.S. Supreme Court school desegregation decision under Chief Justice Earl Warren, who ironically, as the wartime Attorney General of California, had facilitated rounding up Japanese Americans for federal incarceration. Based on decades of organizing for African American desegregation, the order for school desegregation under Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka was a great achievement, but the backlash commenced immediately. White citizens' councils organized all over the United States, linking racial integration with communism and labeling it un-American. Within 3 years of the Supreme Court desegregation decision, the white nationalist John Birch Society was launched by Robert Welch, the heir to the Welch candy fortune in Massachusetts, along with others such as Fred Koch, father of the Koch brothers, who in the 21st century have funded legislation and movements to end all government benefits and promote the privatization of public goods. The Supreme Court composition was the target of this white nationalist movement, using the Republican Party as the vehicle, and had largely achieved its goals with the Trump administration's appointment of 3 justices, shifting the court's ideological spectrum to 5 ultra-conservative justices, 1 moderate conservative and 3 liberal ones. The promise of permanent progress was the context within which the black civil rights movement grew and contributed momentum to other ongoing movements for liberation, including Puerto Rican independence and Native American self-determination, as well as the Mexican farm workers' unionization movement of the 1960s, the women's and LGBTQ rights movements, and the rising student anti-imperialist and anti-war movements that grew in opposition to the accelerating U.S. war to overthrow the government of Vietnam. That's a long sentence. The counter-revolution against these advances brought Richard Nixon, then Ronald Reagan, to the presidency. By the 1990s, capitalism and militarism were triumphant in dissolving the Eastern European Socialist Bloc and organized liberation movements that had taken state power in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, which became shadows of their former aspirations. The first highly visible sign of a well-organized counter-revolution inside the United States vying for political power was the evangelical anti-abortion mass movement that soared following the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision to decriminalize abortion in 1973. And significantly, the relatively benign, century-old National Rifle Association was taken over by the Second Amendment Foundation, a white nationalist organization that had been founded in 1974 by Harlan Carter, who had been the border chief of the 1950s mass deportation of Mexicans in Operation Wetback. This is the moment when the Second Amendment became a white nationalist cause, relying on the right-wing ideology of originalism, that is, interpreting the original meaning of the U.S. Constitution. Parallel to post-war liberation movements, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency ran counterinsurgent operations against national liberation movements before and after they took power in Latin America, the Caribbean, the Pacific, and Africa, while J. Edgar Hoover's Federal Bureau of Investigation ran similar operations against domestic movements, including COINTELPRO, a domestic counterintelligence program. Anti-communism was the connective tissue among these organizations until the socialist bloc collapsed in 1990, although anti-communism remained a social and political weapon of control domestically and internationally. In the mid and late 1960s and early 70s, while the U.S. war in Vietnam raged, the then liberal U.S. ruling class and its brain trust sought ways of responding to social demands while maintaining economic, political, and military domination. They settled on multiculturalism, diversity, affirmative action, and yes, the nation of immigrants ideology in response to demands for decolonization, justice, reparations, social equality, public spending on social welfare, and an end to U.S. imperialism, counterinsurgency, and overthrow of governments. Well, this person really likes their long sentences, but this must be an academic who wrote this, because this has got we're going to include every possible thing that we can fit into this sentence to make sure that it is completely covers everything. Okay. Given attempts to offset an exclusive emphasis on white settler history and the winning of the West as the nationalist triumphal narrative, a nation of immigrants fit the multicultural agenda. No longer was the United States a melting pot of assimilation to whiteness, but rather a many-colored quilt. Kennedy's A Nation of Immigrants had called the United States a nation of nations. Despite the surging of white nationalism during the 12-year period of the Reagan-Bush administrations, by the early 1990s, the wave of immigrants, nation of immigrants, and Native peoples as the first immigrants narrative Kennedy had conceived was a consensus concept as it entered public school textbooks. This neoliberalism was also triggered textbook wars over history standards, with the right wing pushing for and demanding a return to the original narrative, especially founding fathers' iconography to support their constitutional philosophy of originalism. During the nearly 2 centuries of British colonization of North Atlantic coast and up to U.S. independence, the great majority of European U.S. settlers were Protestant, Anglo-Saxon, Scots-Irish, and German-speaking before Germany was a nation-state. From 1619 onward, there was a steadily increasing number of enslaved Africans. When the United States won independence, the founders inscribed in the Constitution the requirement that citizenship could be held by white males only. Despite expressed fears, especially by Alexander Hamilton and the Federalist Party, regarding immigration and the Alien and Sedition Acts, no immigration laws or procedures existed, not even during the arrival in the 1840s of 1.5 million Irish famine refugees. In 1875, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that only the federal government, not the states, could create immigration laws, and that regulation of immigration was a federal matter, though the Federal Immigration Service was not established until 1891. Tellingly, the first federal immigration law, which created the foundation for U.S. immigration, was the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. It is crucial to recognize that when and how immigration as such began, it was based on overt, blatant racism and a policy of exclusion, and it has never lost that taint. Although immigrant bashing is not new and has long targeted Asian and Mexican workers, it has become a more fraught issue as it crystallized in the late 20th century and accelerated in the early 21st century, targeting Mexicans, Asians, and Arab Muslims. Yet those who defend immigrants and immigration, mostly metropolitan liberals, often immigrants or children of immigrants themselves, I feel called out here, employ this idea of nation of immigrants naively without acknowledging the settler colonial history of the United States and the white nationalist ideology it reproduces. I hope that part's not me, but it may be sometimes. Anyway, such advocates were caught by surprise and in shock when Mexican hating led to a successful presidential campaign in 2016, and even more surprised by the January 6, 2021 white nationalist violent takeover attempt at the U.S. Capitol. The elephant in the room of immigration is the U.S. military invasion and annexation of half of Mexican territory that spanned more than 2 decades from 1821 to 1848. During the same period, the eastern half of the United States was ethnically cleansed with the forced removal of native nations. White supremacy and settler colonial violence are permanently embedded in U.S. topography. The United States has a foundational problem of white nationalism that was not new to Nixon or Reagan or Rickson or Trump. White nationalism was inscribed in the founding of the United States as a European settler colonial expansionist entity, the economy of which was grounded in the violent theft of land and in racial slavery, and with settlers armed to the teeth throughout its history, presently numbering over 300 million people with the same number of firearms in civilian hands. Yet only a third of the population own those guns. An average of 8 each, and 3% of the population own 50% of the guns in civilian hands. A great majority of this minority of gun owners are white men who are descendants of the original settlers or pretend to be. These descendants are most obvious in the former Confederate and border states, but are also in reality scattered in clusters and communities in all parts of the United States. They are the latter-day carriers of the U.S. national origin myth, a matrix of stories that attempt to justify conquest and settlement, transforming the white frontier settler into an indigenous people, believing that they are the true natives of the continent, much as the South African Boers regarded themselves as the true children of Israel, powered by Calvinism and Calvinist Scots settlers. Powered by Calvinism. The Calvinist Scots settlers in Ulster, Ireland, or Zionist settlers in Palestine, all established by an imaginary God-given covenant, making them the chosen peoples. Boy, this person is including every possible thing in here. But again, editorial aside, this is closer to what has actually happened and what is continuing to happen than most of the other narratives that you hear. So it's hard, it's tough. You go, oh, well, this is crazy. They're just drawing in all this stuff, but they're just making the connections between these different groups that are doing the same thing in different contexts, but it's the same kind of thing. What the Israelis are doing in Palestinian territory is the same thing that the U.S. settler colonists were doing here. They're just slowly, I mean, I hate to bring up the Hitler comparison, but that's what Hitler's idea of moving into the East was, to just clear out all the people that lived there so Germans could live there. And he took as his inspiration what the British and the Northern Europeans had done in the U.S. with the native people that lived here. So when Hitler first invaded, Poland and all those things, Germans were viewed as liberators. And it wasn't until they started treating everybody like, they had intended to treat them all along that people realized, oh, no, we don't want these guys here. So it wasn't that the Soviets or the Russians were all that popular in their own homeland. That leadership, Stalin's leadership, was not particularly popular, but it was better than what the Germans had in mind, which was you're either going to be killed off or you're going to be a slave to Germans who are coming here. So anyway, again, I mean, I'm doing the same thing this person is doing. It's just like, well, this is like this, which is like this, which is connected to that. I mean, it's kind of hard, and it's difficult to follow if you aren't familiar with all of the individual things that this person is connecting together. But again, this is closer to the literal truth than, the stories that go round and round and round and round and round. Anyway, back to our story. Given the powerful influence of this cultural, religious, and demographic minority, it is essential to acknowledge its existence in order to understand persistent white supremacy and mistrust of non-European immigrants, as well as indigenous North Americans, descendants of enslaved Africans and Mexicans. Since the Iranian Revolution of 1978-79, the United States has launched counterinsurgent wars in Afghanistan and Arab countries, accelerating anti-Muslim bigotry in the United States. And although U.S. evangelicals enthusiastically support the settler state of Israel, which matches their religious belief that Jesus will return when Jews return to Jerusalem, there is an underlying anti-Semitism in U.S. white nationalism, mostly centered on a narrative of imagined Jewish domination, which works to transfer responsibility for capitalist exploitation from European and European U.S. ruling classes to a behind-the-scenes Jewish conspiracy and control. The sacred text of U.S. white nationalists, the Turner Diaries, first published in 1978, is a fictional illustration of that anti-Semitism. It is mixed with hatred of black Americans and all people of color, the argument being that Jews use people of color to conceal their devious plan of dominance, and that the black civil rights movement was controlled by Jews, because white nationalists deem people of color as not fully human and incapable of theory or action on their own. Hard words, but those current realities and their history underlie the narratives of the nation of immigrants. We can see this, for example, in the contemporary neoliberal celebration of founding father Alexander Hamilton. During the Obama administration, the Nation of Immigrants chorus became a best-selling musical, celebrating Hamilton as an immigrant. More than a year after Hamilton premiered on Broadway in 2015, writer and director Lin-Manuel Miranda, who is of Puerto Rican heritage, staged a private performance at the White House for President Obama and his family and invitees. Before the show began, Obama spoke in praise of the work, saying that, in the character of Hamilton, a striving immigrant who escaped poverty, made his way to the New World, climbed to the top by sheer force of will and pluck and determination. Lin-Manuel saw something of his own family and every immigrant family. Portraying Hamilton as an immigrant, although he was a British colonial settler in New York and virulently suspicious of aliens, obfuscates while celebrating his role as a federalist in structuring the fiscal military state, a capitalist state created for war. Further, portraying continental-based Puerto Ricans as immigrants obscures the continued U.S. colonization of Puerto Rico. Okay, clearly I'm going to have to keep stopping here and doing some asides, because a lot of this is pretty hard and harsh. What was I going to say? So, this notion of the nation of immigrants, for a lot of people, pushes back on, or they feel that it pushes back on the white settler colonialism. Let's call it that. And it does embody a truth that is obscured in this particular article, that this article is painting things in very broad strokes. So it's saying, white settler colonialism. Like it's a monumental thing. And everybody that was involved in it is somehow equally complicit, which is true to a degree. But all of these movements, all of these big groups that get painted with singular names like this, they get described as this movement or that movement or this group or that group, it obscures the fact that these are all individual people who are mostly